The man whose name became shorthand for betrayal walks into custody on May 9, 1945, calm, pale, and certain that history is wrong about him. Outside, Oslo erupts with flags and exhausted relief, but inside Møllergata 19, the mood is far more restrained. Norway has survived 5 years of occupation, and the country now stands on the verge between jubilation and judgment. Quisling's surrender is the moment when emotion must give way to law, and when a newly restored state must decide how to confront the most painful symbol of its wartime wounds. Liberation brought a mixture of joy and unsettled reckoning. On the streets, crowds celebrated the return of the government from exile, while at the same time fear simmered that personal rivalries might spill into the open. The country had endured arrests, censorship, deportations, executions, and 5 years of collaborationist governance. Everyone knew Quisling's trial would set the tone for what came next. Would Norway treat its collaborators through revenge or through a legal process grounded in its democratic traditions? In those early days after the surrender, Quisling seemed disconnected from the chaos unfolding around him. Reports describe him walking with an air of solemn certainty, as though he believed his decisions would be cleared once examined rationally. His confidence did not come from strength, but from a worldview in which he had always imagined himself a defender of Norway, an image that the coming investigation would relentlessly test. His interrogators approached him cautiously, documenting each answer, comparing his claims to the administration files German officials had left behind in their hurried retreat. The first sessions revealed a stark gap between Quisling's self-perception and the realities recorded in occupation archives. When confronted with orders he had signed, he insisted they were misunderstood. When asked about his role in the regime's more coercive actions, he described himself as a weakened force. Yet the documents, testimonies, and administrative chains suggested something far more intertwined. A political leader whose cooperation gave German authorities a Norwegian facade for their rule, and who benefited from the authority they granted him. Across Oslo, the Norwegian state was reassembling itself with remarkable speed. Ministries reopened, police forces were purged of collaborators, and judges reclaimed their benches after years in exile or resistance. Amid this reconstruction, the legal purge, Landsviksoppgjøret, took shape. A structured effort to evaluate thousands of cases ranging from minor collaboration to high treason. Unlike spontaneous retaliation in the first hours of liberation, the official purge followed laws predating the occupation as well as emergency provisions implemented by the exile government in London. In this atmosphere, Quisling's case stood apart. He was not merely one collaborator among many, he was the symbol of the occupation itself, the man who had declared a coup on the day German forces landed at Oslo Fjord. Prosecutors recognized that the trial had to be airtight. Any hint of bias or procedural shortcuts could undermine the legitimacy of the entire purge. They assembled a team that cross-checked each allegation with documentation, building a record that stretched from April 1940 to the final days before liberation. Interrogators soon noted that Quisling interpreted their questions philosophically rather than practically. When asked about deportation orders or the internment of political opponents, he spoke of ideological battles, national renewal, and his belief that Norway needed a strong guiding hand. When challenged with evidence of suffering, he deflected responsibility to German officials, claiming he had no power to stop them. The more he spoke, the clearer it became that the trial would not simply examine actions, but the world view that had justified them. Norwegians watched closely. Newspapers reported cautiously, careful to follow the new government's insistence on fairness. Rumours spread about his behaviour in custody, his calm posture, his long-written reflections, his insistence that history misunderstood him. For many, these glimpses into his state of mind only increased the pressure on prosecutors. This trial had to demonstrate beyond any doubt why Norway rejected his claim to legitimacy. Behind closed doors, legal teams mapped out the charges. Treason under pre-war law formed the foundation, but prosecutors also prepared counts related to the deportation of Jews, the persecution of political opponents, and abuses of authority under the regime he led. Each charge required meticulous linkage to documents bearing his signature or orders issued under his government. The weight of the case grew page by page, testimony by testimony. By late summer, Oslo had stabilized enough for the courtroom to become the nation's focus. The government emphasized that justice, not vengeance, would define this moment. Every procedural step was made public, every safeguard was documented. For the Norwegian people, it was a reassurance that the rule of law had survived the occupation's rupture. As August approached, the trial date fixed itself on the national calendar. The public knew little of the evidence, only that it filled tables and cabinets in the prosecutors' offices. Those who had lived under Quisling's rule waited for answers. Those who had suffered directly hoped for recognition, and those who feared the fragility of peace prayed that the process would remain orderly. And yet, beneath all the preparations, a deeper question lingered, one that even the courts could not fully resolve. When Quisling walked into custody, was the nation judging a single man, or was it trying to understand the meaning of betrayal itself? As the courtroom doors were about to open, Norway braced for a confrontation not only with its former leader, but also with the shadow of 5 years it could not forget. The trial was coming, and with it, the moment when the country would attempt to speak the truth aloud. Prosecutors compile a dossier that spans 5 years of occupation and hundreds of thousands of lives affected. In the quiet offices of post-liberation Oslo, where typewriters clatter and stacks of German files are sorted by exhausted clerks, the case against Vidkun Quisling begins to take shape. The city is still recovering from the shock of regained freedom, yet inside these rooms, the mood is focused, methodical, and unyielding. Norway must prove, not guess, the guilt of the man who claimed to rule it. The work starts with a single challenge, defining the boundaries of responsibility. In the years since April 9, 1940, German rule had produced thousands of orders, directives, and reports. Some were signed by German officials, others had the marks of National Samling's ministries. Many were stamped with Quisling's own hand. Sorting them was more than an administrative task. It was the effort to rebuild a factual narrative after half a decade of fear and censorship. Prosecutors knew the nation was watching. Every charge needed to stand on evidence that would survive the closest scrutiny. 3 major categories emerged. The first was treason, rooted in pre-war law, aiding an invading power, undermining national sovereignty, and assuming authority without constitutional legitimacy. The second involved responsibility for the arrest and deportation of Jews and political opponents. The third focused on abuses of office, allocations, coercive policies, and the machinery of forced loyalty. Each category required a separate chain of proof. Each demanded corroboration through testimony, documents, and official records left behind in offices once controlled by occupiers. Investigators searched through abandoned German headquarters, retrieving boxes of files, correspondence, and administrative logs. Much of the evidence had survived intact. The Germans had surrendered quickly, giving little time to burn archives. What remained captured the full apparatus of occupation: deportation lists, political reports, surveillance notes, and minutes from meetings in which Quisling participated, or whose outcomes he later endorsed. These documents formed the spine of the case, showing not only what decisions were made, but how Norwegian collaboration enabled them. Witnesses added depth to the paper trail. Civil servants described how ministries had been reorganized under national Samling. Police officers spoke of pressure to identify heretics. Members of the resistance, who had spent years living in secrecy, now testified openly about arrests and interrogations. For some, entering the courtroom was a symbolic moment, an opportunity to speak under law after years of silence. Their testimonies were handled carefully. The goal was clarity, not emotion. Prosecutors repeatedly reminded them factual precision mattered more than verbiage. Quisling's defense saw these preparations with growing concern. His lawyer, Harold Pedersen, understood the gravity of the situation. Their defense strategy hinged on one argument, that Quisling, as head of a government installed by German authorities, had operated within a constitutional framework, however unusual the circumstances. If he could establish that his administration was a legitimate Norwegian government under occupation, then treason, by legal definition, would be harder to prove. Pedersen gathered every remaining document, memo, and diary entry that could suggest Quisling had acted to protect Norway from worse German measures. Quisling himself contributed eagerly to this narrative. During interrogations, he insisted that he had been a shield, not a collaborator. He described his meetings with German officials as negotiations in which he tried to preserve Norwegian institutions. He claimed that the deportation of Jews had been outside his control, that he had attempted to intervene, and that German forces held ultimate power. He framed his decisions as a tragic necessity in a time of crisis. Yet, as investigators laid his statements alongside administrative records, key contradictions emerged. Orders he denied authoring matched those stored in German archives. Statements he claimed to have made in defense of civilians were unsupported by documents. By midsummer, the accusation began to diminish. On the 17th of August 1945, prosecutors formally charged Quisling with treason under Norwegian law, responsibility for deportations and targeted persecutions, and abuses of authority for personal and political gain. The document was precise, its language restrained. It did not accuse him of actions he did not take. It focused only on those for which the evidence was concrete. Still, building the case presented challenges. Some German officers who might have testified were dead or had disappeared. Certain actions were carried out by German security units whose internal records were limited. Prosecutors had to differentiate between German and Norwegian chains of command, demonstrating where Quisling's authority began and where it ended. They could not attribute to him actions outside his influence, but neither could they ignore decisions that his government facilitated, endorsed, or enabled. The process was slow, deliberate, and occasionally tense. The legal teams debated wording, reviewed precedents, and consulted historians who had studied the rise of National Samling. They sought to understand not only the actions, but the ideology that motivated them. Each layer of the case added another dimension: political ambition, administrative compliance, ideological commitment, and the personal decisions that turned abstract ideas into lived reality. The most difficult charge involved the deportation of Jews from Norway. Records showed that Norwegian police, under orders from the collaborationist government, participated in arrests. Quisling's involvement varied depending on the document, but his administration had signed decrees enabling the process. Prosecutors approached this section with particular care. They did not claim he had directed every detail. Instead, they showed how his policies provided legal and administrative cover for German operations. The distinction was vital. The trial would not rely on exaggeration. As the evidence piled higher in the prosecutor's office, the atmosphere shifted. What began as a legal task gradually became a national reckoning. Clerks who assembled documents knew their work would shape how Norway understood its own past. Every testimony, every file, every signature connected to individual experiences of the decisions made at the top of the collaborationist government. Quisling became increasingly aware of the growing weight of the case. Those who observed his interrogations noted moments when he seemed unsettled by the sheer volume of documents compiled against him. Yet he maintained the same earnest certainty that guided his earlier political life, confidence that once explained, his actions would appear justified. It was a belief prosecutors knew the court would soon confront directly. When the final stacks of evidence were arranged in the courtroom, their presence spoke louder than any argument. In these pages lies the story of occupation told through administrative footprints, and as Quisling prepared to face them, even he could not ignore the fact that history had preserved every order he once believed would define a new Norway. The trial was now only days away, and the nation waited to see whether the documents, testimonies, and charges would finally reveal the truth about the man who had claimed to lead them. But the courtroom doors had not yet opened, and the battle between narrative and fact was only beginning. Every seat is taken as Vidkun Quisling steps into the Oslo courtroom on the 20th of August 1945, wearing a plain civilian suit, no insignia, no medals, nothing that signals the authority he once claimed. He holds himself with the same solemn composure he displayed during his surrender, but the room around him has changed. It is no longer a political stage, nor the controlled environment of interrogations. Here, under restored Norwegian law, the rules are clear, the judges impartial, and the evidence unavoidable. For the first time since 1940, Quisling must answer publicly for the choices that shaped 5 years of occupation. The trial room has been arranged with deliberate transparency. Norway wants no suggestion of victor's justice. Rows of benches accommodate journalists, foreign observers, and ordinary citizens who managed to secure one of the limited seats. The judges sit above the chamber, cold but calm, signalling that this process belongs not to emotion but to law. On the prosecution's table lie the thick folders of documents collected over the summer, files bearing German stamps, Norwegian police reports, minutes from National Samling meetings, and the administrative orders that define the case. Quisling sits at the defense table with his lawyer, Harold Pedersen. His posture is steady, his gaze measured. Observers remark that he looks more like a professor preparing to deliver a lecture than a defendant facing charges that could end in his execution. When asked to confirm his identity, he speaks clearly. When asked how he pleads, he answers with conviction, not guilty. From that moment forward, the courtroom becomes the country's lens into the mechanics of collaboration. Testimonies begin with an almost clinical tone. Officials who served under the occupation describe how ministries were reorganized, how decrees were issued, and how loyalty was monitored. They explain how Quisling's government interacted with German authorities, how decisions flowed between Oslo and Berlin, and how police were directed to enforce ideological conformity. Many of these witnesses speak without bitterness. They are there to narrate structures, not emotions. Yet beneath their measured accounts lies the memory of a government that replaced law with obedience. Quisling listens intently, sometimes taking notes. When a witness's account challenges his version of events, he leans forward as though preparing to respond. At times, he appears frustrated. At others, almost indifferent. Observers describe a man deeply invested in the idea that he alone understood the logic of his actions, even as those actions are dissected before him. Then the prosecution introduces a different category of testimony. Administrative secretaries, clerks, and mid-level officials discuss internal meetings where orders were issued. They recall directives related to the arrest of dissidents, restrictions on the press, and the implementation of policies that mirrored German ideology. These testimonies show how individual decisions in Quisling's cabinet translated into daily pressure on ordinary Norwegians. The prosecution does not dramatize these points. The facts themselves carry weight. The most difficult testimonies involve those affected directly by the actions of the collaborationist government. A former resistance member describes his arrest and the interrogation that followed. A civil servant recalls being dismissed for refusing to join National Samling. Survivors of deportation efforts speak quietly, some addressing the court with steady detail, others pausing as memories resurface. The court listens with care, allowing them space while ensuring that the trial remains focused on documented facts rather than emotional appeals. Their presence is a reminder that the occupation was not an abstract political debate. It was a lived reality. Throughout these proceedings, Quisling's defense attempts to reframe the narrative. Pedersen presents his client as a political leader trapped between German demands and Norwegian needs. He submits letters that Quisling wrote to German officials requesting moderation. He highlights moments where Quisling objected to certain measures, arguing that he acted as a buffer rather than an accomplice. Pedersen returns repeatedly to one central theme, that Quisling's government, however controversial, was an attempt to preserve Norwegian institutions in unusual circumstances. The prosecution counters by demonstrating gaps between these claims and the documented outcomes. The letters Pedersen cites are placed alongside orders Quisling signed that aligned closely with German policy. The argument that he acted as a shield is weighed against administrative decisions that facilitated deportations and political repression. At no point does the prosecution exaggerate. Instead, they rely on a steady accumulation of facts, signatures, directives, and chains of responsibility. Observers notice that as the days pass, the distance between Quisling's narrative and the courtroom's reality grows more prominent. His statements often rely on interpretations or philosophical justifications, while the prosecution's evidence focuses on concrete actions. Witness after witness describes systems he oversaw or policies he approved. Transcripts from National Samling meetings reveal ideological commitments that contradict his attempts to portray himself as a reluctant participant. The more he speaks, the clearer it becomes that he inhabits a worldview shaped by his own political imagination rather than by the consequences his decisions produced. Despite the tension, the courtroom maintains discipline. Judges intervene only when necessary, keeping the process measured and fair. They remind both sides to focus on evidence rather than speculation. Even the public in attendance, many of whom had endured years of occupation, remain mostly silent. Their presence alone communicates the weight of history unfolding before them. As the final week of testimony approaches, the case against Quisling stands largely intact. The prosecution has linked his decisions to documented outcomes. The defense has tried to humanize his motivations, but the court now holds a dense record showing the alignment between his ideology, his policies, and the realities experienced under occupation. The facts, laid out in diaries, orders, transcripts, and personal accounts, form a structure that no argument can fully escape. By early September, the momentum of the trial shifts. The judges prepare to deliberate, and both sides sense the gravity of what comes next. The evidence is no longer a collection of papers. It has become a narrative with legal weight, connecting a decade of political ambition and wartime decision-making to the lives of thousands of Norwegians. And as the courtroom settles into a rare moment of quiet, one truth becomes clear. Quisling's understanding of himself is drifting further away from the story the documents tell. Soon, the judges will step behind closed doors to deliver a verdict that will echo far beyond this room. But for now, the doors remain open, the air is still, and the nation waits to see how the law will interpret the man whose name became synonymous with treason. Before judges can weigh his guilt, they must first understand the movement he built and how it aligned itself with the machinery of occupation. The trial has already exposed contrasts between Quisling's self-image and the outcomes of his policies, but to understand the deeper logic of collaboration, the court must look backward. It must trace the roots of the ideology that shaped his decisions, the networks that enabled his rise, and the political ambitions that linked Norway's domestic landscape to broader currents in Europe. Years before German troops crossed into Norway on the 9th of April 1940, Quisling had begun crafting a movement he believed would reshape the nation. National Samling, founded in the early 1930s, presented itself as a bold alternative to parliamentary politics. It borrowed ideas from European fascist models, corporatism, authoritarian unity, the exaltation of national discipline, yet wrapped them in the language of Norwegian renewal. For a small segment of society, the party offered structure and clarity at a time of economic strain. For most Norwegians, however, it appeared rigid, out of touch, and deeply suspicious. By the late 1930s, National Samling had little political traction. It won no parliamentary seats. Its rallies were modest, its influence limited. But its ideology remained intact, a belief in centralized authority, cultural homogeneity, and the moral necessity of a strong hand to guide national destiny. This worldview would later become the interpretive lens through which Quisling justified his actions under occupation. When Germany invaded, Quisling interpreted the moment as an opportunity rather than a catastrophe. His coup-style broadcast on the morning of 9th April 1940, in which he claimed leadership and ordered resistance forces to stand down, was not an impulsive gesture. It was a political calculation rooted in his long-standing conviction that parliamentary Norway had failed. The German leadership, however, did not trust him. For the first 2 years of occupation, he remained largely sidelined, overshadowed by Reichskommissar Josef Terboven, who viewed National Samling as useful but subordinate. Still, the collaboration deepened. Documents introduced during the trial show a steady series of meetings between Quisling and German officials, each one negotiating the boundaries of Norwegian autonomy under German control. These were not equal conversations. German authorities dictated terms. Quisling sought to expand influence within those constraints. The arrangement suited both sides. Berlin gained smoother administration, and Quisling received a platform to implement elements of his ideological vision. That vision became visible in the reorganization of civilian life. Schools were encouraged to align curricula with National Samling principles, emphasizing obedience and national revival. Youth organizations were reshaped to mirror the structures of continental fascism. Cultural policies promoted Nordic unity while discouraging expressions considered foreign or provocative. Even churches were pressured to adjust practices, though most resisted, provoking tensions that echoed throughout the occupation. Where ideology intersected with power, collaboration intensified. Police structures were reorganized to identify dissent and enforce the new order. Civil servants were expected to demonstrate loyalty or risk removal. Surveillance expanded as local officials compiled lists of suspected opponents. During the trial, the prosecution presented documents showing that these policies emerged not from German improvisation, but from National Samling's internal plans. The party's ideology, once marginal, had become a tool of governance. One of the most significant elements examined by the court involved the identification and targeting of specific groups. The trial did not sensationalize these practices, but it documented their mechanisms. National Samling officials provided information to German security services, flagged individuals deemed politically dangerous, and helped enforce regulations that isolated Jews, communists, and resistance networks. While German agencies carried out many of the harshest actions, the Norwegian administrative support, enabled by Quisling's government, gave those operations greater reach. This was the heart of the prosecution's argument, that ideology, when paired with authority, produced complicity. Documents from occupation archives showed a frequent pattern in which National Samling's principles, national purity, political unity, cultural conformity, aligned closely with German expectations. Even when Quisling claimed in court that he had opposed certain measures, the records revealed that his government provided structural support for them. Yet the trial also explored ambiguity. Some Norwegian officials resisted or slowed the implementation of policies. Certain ministries attempted to retain pre-war practices. Not all members of National Samling were equally committed to its vision. Judges examined these nuances carefully, recognizing that collaboration occurred along a spectrum, not as a uniform bloc. But at the center of this spectrum stood Quisling, whose ideological convictions framed the administrative decisions that shaped daily life. The court's examination of ideology culminated in a deeper understanding. Quisling's political project had not merely failed, it had become inseparable from the occupation's coercive apparatus. What began as a marginal movement in the 1930s had, through its alignment with foreign power, evolved into an instrument that disrupted institutions, suppressed conflict, and facilitated the compliance of Norwegian society. By revisiting these roots, the judges gained clarity on the choices Quisling made when he accepted leadership under German authority. This context would soon shape their understanding of the evidence, providing a framework that connected his ideological ambitions to the practical realities of occupation. And as the examination drew to a close, one truth grew sharper. The trial was no longer just about actions taken between 1940 and 1945. It was about the political architecture that made those actions possible. Soon, the court would return to the present, where documents, testimonies, and 5 years of lived history awaited their final legal evaluation. But before the verdict could be formed, the judges had to confront the ideological foundation that guided the man seated before them, a foundation that now stood exposed under the full light of Norwegian law. After 21 days of testimony, cross-examination, and the steady unfolding of 5 years' worth of documents, the Oslo courtroom falls into a full quietness. It is the 10th of September, 1945, and the presiding judge prepares to deliver the decision that Norway has awaited since the moment its liberation began. Vidkun Quisling sits upright, hands folded before him, expression fixed. Whatever his expectations, this is the moment where narrative and evidence finally meet under the full weight of restored Norwegian law. The judges begin by addressing the foundation of the case, treason. They return to the morning of 9th April 1940, when Quisling declared himself head of government over Norwegian radio while German forces advanced toward Oslo. They describe this broadcast not as an act of patriotic rescue, as he had repeatedly claimed, but as a direct violation of constitutional order. The court cites pre-war statutes that remained in force throughout the occupation, noting that loyalty to an invading power, even if framed as political necessity, constituted treason under Norwegian law. The words are measured, deliberate, and free of emotion, but their implications are unmistakable. Next, the judges turn to the charge that carries the greatest moral weight: responsibility for deportations and the targeting of vulnerable groups. They present the administrative chain in detail: Quisling's signatures on decrees, his government's role in identifying individuals, and the policies that synchronized Norwegian institutions with German demands. The court emphasizes that while German authorities executed many of the direct actions, Quisling's government provided the legal and logistical framework that made them possible. It is a straight conclusion, built on documentation rather than rhetoric. Throughout this reading, Quisling listens without visible reaction. Observers note that he appears almost serene, as though hearing an evaluation of someone else's life. His defense argument, that he had attempted to shield Norway from harsher measures, is acknowledged, but the court explains why it cannot accept it. The evidence shows that whatever private objections he may have voiced, his public actions aligned with the occupation's goals. When the German authorities sought administrative cooperation, he provided it. When they required Norwegian assistance, his government supplied it. The verdict continues with the charge of abuse of authority. The judges describe how his government used political pressure, ideological conformity, and administrative restructuring to shape Norwegian society according to National Samling's vision. These findings are not presented as personal condemnations, but as legal conclusions drawn from documented decisions. The judges emphasize that the role of government carries responsibility for outcomes, even when final decisions were influenced by foreign power. Then, after addressing each count in sequence, the court announces the conclusion: guilty on all major charges. The sentence is death by firing squad, reflecting the severity of high treason in wartime. No applause breaks out. No shouts of triumph fill the air. The courtroom remains silent, absorbing the weight of the moment. The judge's tone makes clear that this is not an act of revenge. It is the application of law to a case that by its nature tested the very boundaries of national justice. Across Norway, reactions unfold in complex ways. Some greet the verdict with quiet relief, believing it closes a chapter of humiliation and occupation. Others feel unsettled, aware that thousands of lesser cases remain unresolved, each with its own ambiguities. A small number who once supported National Samling deny the fairness of the process, though they are unable to refute the evidence. For many, the verdict represents not celebration, but sobriety, a reminder that the country must confront its wartime divisions while resisting the urge to simplify them. In the weeks that follow, newspapers publish careful summaries of the decision. Editorials praise the trial's transparency. Foreign observers note the stark contrast between Norway's legal process and the spontaneous reprisals seen elsewhere in Europe. Diplomats remark on the country's insistence on procedure, even in the trial of the man most associated with betrayal. The message is clear. The new Norway is rebuilding itself not through vengeance, but through law. Yet the story is not finished. Under Norwegian legal tradition, even a man found guilty of high treason has the right to appeal. The Supreme Court must examine the case, review the record, and decide whether the sentence will stand. The public waits, some anxiously, others with a sense of inevitability. The judges, meanwhile, withdraw into the quiet of their chambers, carrying with them a case that has become inseparable from the national memory of occupation. As Quisling is escorted back to his cell at Møllergata 19, he maintains the same composure he has shown since the trial began. He believes history will acquit him. The prosecutors believe the documents have already spoken, and the nation, standing between these two convictions, now turns its eyes to the final stage of legal review. The trial has delivered its judgment, but one more decision remains before Norway can close the case of its most infamous collaborator. In the days following the verdict of 10th September 1945, a different kind of silence settles over Oslo. The frenzy of courtroom debate has faded, replaced by the steady rhythm of legal review. Even in a case as monumental as this, Norway insists on due process. The Supreme Court must confirm the judgment before any sentence can be carried out. For the nation, this final step becomes a test of its commitment to fairness. For Vidkun Quisling, it becomes the narrow space through which he hopes history might still reconsider him. Inside Møllergata 19 prison, Quisling awaits word from his lawyer. His cell is sparse, bare walls, a narrow bed, a small table on which he arranges his notes. Guards describe him as calm, even courteous. Several times a day, he writes, producing long reflections on politics, philosophy, and his belief that posterity will someday understand his intentions. These writings do not resemble the thoughts of a man resigned to his fate. They reflect the certainty that has defined his life, the unwavering belief that his choices were rational, even necessary. Harold Pedersen visits him frequently. The defense attorney prepares the appeal with the same care he devoted to the trial, focusing on procedural points and the argument that Quisling's government, however unorthodox, operated within a framework created by exceptional wartime circumstances. Pedersen also attempts to re-emphasize the claim that Quisling did not intend to betray Norway, but sought to protect it from what he believed would be a more destructive German occupation. The appeal does not seek to undo the historical record, it aims to challenge how the law interprets Quisling's role within it. Meanwhile, the Supreme Court judges work through the trial materials with methodical precision. They read transcripts, examine documents, and weigh the legal arguments with the same restraint that characterized the lower court proceedings. Their task is not to revisit occupation history, but to ensure that the verdict was reached through sound legal reasoning. In a country emerging from the trauma of foreign rule, this commitment to judicial integrity becomes a cornerstone of national renewal. On the 13th of October 1945, the Supreme Court delivered its decision. The conviction stands. The sentence remains unchanged. The ruling is firm, unanimous, and concise. With this final legal step completed, the case enters its last phase. The Cabinet must authorize the execution, a formality in most treason cases, but still a deliberate act. Ministers consider the ruling, mindful of Norway's broader effort to rebuild a stable society grounded in law. Their approval is recorded without flourish. Word of the decision reaches Quisling quickly. If he is shaken, he does not show it. Instead, he continues writing, producing letters that mix personal reflection with appeals to future readers. In them, he presents himself as a misunderstood patriot, someone whose actions were interpreted without full appreciation of the pressures he faced. These letters reveal a man who cannot reconcile his self-perception with the judgment of his country. They are not pleas for mercy, but attempts to frame his legacy on his own terms. Visitors during these final days are few. A pastor meets with him regularly to offer counsel. Medical staff check his condition, ensuring that the process adheres strictly to regulations. Guards rotate their shifts quietly, aware that they are witnessing the closing chapter of a figure whose name has already entered the language of betrayal. Despite the gravity of the moment, there is no spectacle, no dramatization. Norway has chosen to treat even its most infamous collaborator with the dignity afforded by law. Quisling's final petition for pardon reaches the Cabinet, but it cannot overcome the weight of the evidence nor the legal precedent established in treason cases. The petition is denied. As the decision is communicated to him, he remains composed. He asks for certain personal items to be kept with him, requests time for prayer, and offers no protest. He has always believed that history would render a different verdict than the one delivered by the court. He maintains that belief now, even as the end approaches. On the morning of the 24th of October 1945, before dawn breaks over Oslo, Quisling is escorted from his cell. The walk to Akershus Fortress is short, carried out under guard. The fortress, with its ancient stone walls and view over the still waters of Oslo, has witnessed centuries of Norwegian history, but never an execution as symbolically weighted as this one. Officials present follow a strict procedure. The process is solemn, quiet, and without ceremony. Quisling does not resist. Accounts vary slightly on his final expressions, but consistent reports suggest he remained calm. He faces the firing squad without dramatic declarations, offering a few brief final words of faith and conviction. Moments later, the sentence is carried out. There are no crowds, no public display. Only those required by law are present. When news of the execution spreads, the national response is suppressed. Many feel a sense of finality, not triumph. The case that dominated the summer of 1945 has ended, but the broader questions it raised, about collaboration, loyalty and justice, remain woven into Norway's post-war consciousness. Editorials reflect on the significance of the moment, noting that Norway managed to try and execute the man who aligned himself with its occupiers without abandoning the very democratic values the occupation tried to destroy. For the country, the execution is not a conclusion but a transition. The legal purge continues. Thousands of cases await judgment. Families divided by occupation face years of reconciliation. Norway must rebuild trust, institutions, and confidence in its political life. Yet the trial and final days of Vidkun Quisling mark a critical moment in that process. The affirmation that justice, not vengeance, would guide the nation into the post-war world. And as the fortress settles back into silence, one question remains for the generations that follow. How does a society rebuild its identity after confronting the legacy of collaboration? And what does it mean to remember a figure whose name has become synonymous with betrayal? After the gunshots faded over Akershus Fortress on the 24th of October 1945, Norway entered a quieter, more complicated chapter of its post-war recovery. The trial and execution of Vidkun Quisling had concluded the most symbolically charged case of the legal purge, but the deeper national reckoning was only beginning. In every town, courthouse and ministry, Norwegians now confronted the reality that collaboration had taken many forms and that the country's path forward would depend on how it chose to interpret its own recent past. In the months following Quisling's execution, the landssvikoppgjøret, the legal purge, expanded to its full scale. Tens of thousands of cases passed through courts across the country. Some involved minor violations, membership in National Samling, work performed under German direction, or participation in propaganda. Others were more severe, including actions that aided the Gestapo or disrupted resistance networks. Each case required careful examination. Judges, prosecutors, and defense attorneys worked under extraordinary pressure, determined to avoid sweeping generalizations while still addressing the very real damage the occupation had inflicted. As these trials unfolded, Quisling's case became a reference point, but never a template. It stood apart due to its importance, its visibility, and the position he held. Most Norwegians understood that the leader of a collaborationist government could not be judged in the same manner as a police clerk who felt compelled to keep his job or a farmer who delivered goods under occupation. The courts recognized this distinction. They weighed intent, degree of involvement, and the circumstances of wartime coercion. The process was imperfect, but it reflected an effort to balance justice with recognition of moral complexity. Norwegian newspapers reported regularly on the progress of the legal purge. Articles appeared about sentences, acquittals, and the ongoing tension between accountability and reconciliation. Commentators observed that the country remained divided, not between those who had resisted and those who had collaborated, but between those who sought closure through punishment and those who hoped to rebuild social bonds as quickly as possible. The memory of occupation had created wounds that law alone could not heal. Within this broader struggle, Quisling's legacy took on an enduring symbolic weight. His name, already used during the war as a synonym for treachery, now became firmly embedded in global vocabulary. To be a Quisling was to be a traitor, someone who betrayed their country to foreign power. The term spread through newspapers, diplomatic circles, and everyday conversation, transcending Norway's borders. This linguistic transformation reflected the moral severity with which the world interpreted his actions. It also shaped how future generations would encounter his story, less as a political figure from a specific era and more as an archetype of betrayal. Yet the process of remembering Quisling was not simple. Some Norwegians felt that focusing too heavily on him risked overshadowing the experiences of ordinary people who suffered under occupation. Others believed that his story should be studied precisely because it revealed how fragile democratic structures could be when confronted with external pressure and internal ambition. Historians debated his motivations. Philosophers debated the moral weight of collaboration. Survivors debated how much attention should be given to the man whose decisions contributed to their suffering. As these conversations unfolded, the Norwegian state worked to rebuild trust in its institutions. The return of the monarchy and the restoration of parliamentary government marked a symbolic rebirth. New elections strengthened the public's confidence that democracy had survived. Ministries re-established their authority, schools reintroduced pre-war curricula, and civil society slowly reconnected its fractured threads. In this environment, the transparent handling of Quisling's trial was frequently cited as a cornerstone of Norway's restored legitimacy. The process also prompted a broader examination of how countries remember difficult histories. Some nations emerging from occupation or conflict chose to bury uncomfortable truths. Norway chose to confront them directly. By documenting trials, preserving archives, and allowing public access to records, it created a foundation for historical accountability that would shape scholarship for decades. The country's approach demonstrated that memory, when anchored in evidence and reflection, could be a tool for reconstruction rather than division. But the legacy of collaboration did not end in courtrooms or archives. Families long avoided discussing wartime divisions, and in many communities, relationships strained by suspicion took years to mend. Teachers struggled to explain the complexities of the occupation to students living in peace. Veterans of the resistance found themselves both celebrated and isolated, their memories honoured, yet their experiences difficult to share. The emotional landscape of post-war Norway was uneven, marked by pride, grief, guilt, and relief in patterns that defied easy categorization. Through all of this, Quisling's trial remained a focal point, a moment when the nation had paused, gathered its evidence, and articulated the values it intended to carry forward. The trial had not erased collaboration, it had contextualized it. It had not resolved every moral question, it had provided a framework for asking them. And it had not healed all wounds, it had shown that justice, even when imperfect, could help a fractured society begin to rebuild. By the late 1940s, as Norway stabilized and turned its attention to reconstruction, the significance of the trial settled into place. It became part of the country's civic memory, referenced in textbooks and public debates, studied by legal scholars and historians, and invoked whenever questions arose about loyalty, authority, and the responsibility of leadership. The image of Quisling in the courtroom, composed, certain, defending decisions that had reshaped a nation, remained an enduring reminder of how easily democratic institutions can be tested, and how essential it is to preserve them. Norway would continue to wrestle with the shadows of occupation, but the meaning of the trial remained, not as a story about vengeance, but as a testament to the power of law at a moment when the country could have turned to rage. And as decades passed, one lesson stood out above all, the understanding that justice, memory, and vigilance are inseparable in the life of a nation rebuilding itself after betrayal. If this chapter of Norway's post-war reckoning gave you a deeper understanding of justice after occupation, consider supporting the channel. Like, share, and subscribe to help more viewers discover the hidden histories behind World War II's aftermath. And tell us below, how should a society remember betrayal once the war is over?